Well, good evening, folks. We're so grateful that you're joining us, whether you're joining us at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, July 20th, or sometime later this week, or are stumbling upon this video in the year 2025 on YouTube. We're so delighted that you're joining us for this Pray Then in This Way, this Lord's Prayer series that we're doing as a collaboration between Williamsburg Baptist Church and Ginter Park Baptist Church in Richmond. And tonight, Jennifer McNeel is joining us to share about the context of the Lord's Prayer in Matthew and Luke. And so I should say Dr. Jen McNeel. And so Jen, we're delighted that you're joining us. Thanks so much. Would love for you to just introduce yourself briefly, if you're willing, before jumping in and sharing what you're presenting tonight.
Sure. So as Art mentioned before the recording started, but I'll repeat now, Art and I know one another from Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia, where we both went for our PhD program. Since that time, I moved back to Maryland, where I come from. I live in Columbia, Maryland now, and I teach at the St. Mary's Ecumenical Institute. So there's a Catholic seminary in Baltimore, Maryland, and they have an Ecumenical Institute as part of their offerings. And I teach in that program, New Testament and biblical studies in general, a little bit introductory stuff for both testaments. But my specialty is in New Testament.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that's about it, I guess.
Thanks for joining us.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint of my presentation. So just give me a second for that. Can everybody see it?
That's so pretty.
Thank you. I can't really take credit. I mean, PowerPoint made it, you know. I selected it, though, out of many options. So there you go. All right. So as a teacher of biblical studies, one of the most important things that I feel like I'm always trying to instill in my students is the importance of context. Actually, you know, us biblical scholars are word nerds, so I'm breaking down the word context here in English. So the word, the con on context comes from the Latin prefix that means together or with. So I like to think of context as being what comes with the text. So we have this, you know, what we might sometimes think of as an isolated set of words on a page that we could pull out and you know, use in any way we want to. But in reality, a lot of information comes with that text if we take the time to pay attention to it. So there's a lot of different kinds of context, including historical context, which is of course very important. But what I want to focus on tonight is literary context, which basically is just the idea that any given passage from the Bible is not an isolated thing, but comes to us as part of a larger book or a narrative or a letter or whatever it's part of in the Bible. And so taking that into account is important for understanding its meaning. So when Art and I began conversations about me writing an article for this issue, since I have a little bit of a context obsession, that was the first place my mind went to ask myself the question, what difference does it make if we read the Lord's Prayer in the context of the book of Matthew versus if we read it in the context of its place in the book of Luke? So the content of the prayer in those two places is similar, but the context is different. Now, of course, the content isn't exactly the same. I don't know if any of your other presentations have gone into that or not. Luke's version is a little bit shorter than Matthew's version. So they're not exactly the same, but they share much in terms of content with one another. However, I think the context is really quite different for the two of them in the two different gospels. So that's what we're going to be looking at tonight.
And if I can just say briefly, I think it's such a worthy conversation because we so often encounter the Lord's Prayer entirely without context. When we just pray it in worship, we don't get, you know, that's the main way that most of us encounter it.
Right.
If I say Ginter Park people, we're praying the Lucan version this week. FYI.
Oh, interesting. I've
Yep.
never had a church do that before. That would throw people off, I would think. Like, wait, where's the rest of the words?
Yeah, yep. It's the lectionary text this week. I thought it made only sense to pray in that way. So,
amen.
So my article basically takes them in turn. So I start with Matthew, looking at the prayer in the context of Matthew. So the context in Matthew is the Sermon on the Mount. So the prayer is embedded in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, really in the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount, probably most of you know this, but I don't know the background of everybody on this Zoom call or watching this video later. The Sermon on the Mount is a major sermon or discourse given by Jesus early in Matthew's gospel, shortly after calling his first disciples. So we're very early in Jesus' ministry when the Sermon on the Mount occurs in Matthew. And it takes up chapters 5 through 7 of the gospel. So the Sermon on the Mount introduces readers of Matthew to the content of Jesus' teaching, because again, it's early in his ministry, so it kind of gives the reader the first kind of understanding or glimpse of what Jesus' teaching is all about. And it introduces the idea of discipleship and what discipleship looks like, particularly in the Matthew flavor. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus sort of conveys and interprets the law, or what we might call the teaching of the kingdom of God, although Matthew often calls it the kingdom of heaven. But we're not going to get into that tonight. And the sermon really the sermon as a whole creates an inseparable bond between faith and behavior. So what we believe, what our attitudes are, what our relationship with God is, and then how we act that out in the world. So with the Lord's Prayer being within the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, I would say that the meaning of the prayer based on that context is that praying in this way is part of learning to be a disciple of Jesus. So the prayer is not really an end in itself, but again, it's part of a life of learning to be a disciple of Jesus. So I do want to talk a little bit about the idea of righteousness, because that's a theme that comes up in the Gospel of Matthew with greater frequency than the other Gospels. And so in Matthew, learning to live as a disciple of Jesus is closely tied to this idea of righteousness. So I like to define righteousness as the the character of a life that is lived as it should be, with a right relationship to God, to other people, and to the world. So Jesus interprets the law in the Sermon on the Mount for his followers. As he's doing that, he's showing them how to live a righteous life, particularly a life that is characterized by compassion, justice, mercy, and an inner disposition of faithfulness toward God. So to sum up, we could say that the Sermon on the Mount is about the proper joining of faith and practice, or faith and behavior, and that this is the context in which Matthew places the Lord's Prayer. So we should therefore expect the Lord's Prayer to have something to do with faith and practice, or that is something to do with righteousness. So to see that a little bit in more detail, we're going to look a little bit closer at where Matthew places the prayer within the sermon. Now, I know that on your screen, this might look like really small print. If you happen to have a Bible handy and you'd rather look at it that way, it's fine. It's Matthew 6, 5 to 14. But I wanted to put so much on the screen, even though it makes the word small, because we're talking about context. So I wanted to put more than just a little bit on the screen. This, by the way, is the version taken from the NRSV UE, which is a brand new revision of the NRSV. So I'm kind of using this for the first time here. And there is actually one change that's very significant, which makes my article a little bit out of date, but that's okay. And that's actually in the changes from the old NRSV is in the first verse there that I have on the screen. So this is the verse that introduces the part of, this isn't the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, but it's the beginning of the part of the Sermon on the Mount that in which the Lord's Prayer appears. So in 6:1, Jesus says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven." So the old NRSV says, beware of practicing your piety before others, which is a translation I've always hated with a passion. And I used my article as a place to say that the NRSV is wrong to translate the text this way. And now the NRSV no longer translates the text that way. So I take it as a victory.
Maybe someone was listening.
Yeah, maybe. Of course, the article wasn't really published until.
No, it wasn't. Jen, what in your
can't take credit, but.
What in your mind what's the difference between piety and righteousness?
Well, I mean, part of my objection to piety is just that the Greek word that stands behind it is not usually translated as piety in other places. So the English reader wouldn't really know what is the connection between this and when he's talking about righteousness elsewhere, So that's one problem. Piety also, I think, has sort of a negative connotation to our culture, sort of like a high and mighty, I'm better than you kind of way of living life, which is obviously, I don't think what Jesus is going for here with the idea of righteousness in general. So,
right.
Yeah. So talking about with our new revised translation of the NRSV, practicing your righteousness, or even a more literal translation of the text here would be doing your righteousness, which sounds weird to us, but sometimes doing a very literal translation that sounds weird is helpful to get us into the idea of what the words really mean. So the idea of doing righteousness is a wonderful expression of Matthew's way of combining sort of inner faithfulness or inner devotion to God with outward action in the world. Because again, I think righteousness can sometimes maybe have a connotation to us in English that it's just a quality that a person has. So the idea of doing it, that it's something that you do, is helpful. So righteousness is something that you practice. In this particular case, Jesus is warning that righteousness should not be done in order to impress other people. When it is, he says, this basically the social reward that you receive immediately from impressing other people is the only reward that you will get. Righteousness should be done for its own sake, in sort of, faithful obedience to God, not for the sake of getting honor from others. So then what follows that first verse of chapter 6 is a series of 3 examples in which one's sort of inner faithfulness and outer actions with our bodies and our actions in the world should be done secretly so that God will be the one to reward you. So the 3 examples are almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. The first 2 of those you can see here on this slide. The third one comes on the next slide. But of course, since we're talking about the Lord's Prayer, we're going to focus most on that middle example of prayer. So skipping a few verses, I'm going to read 5 and 6. And it says, whenever you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, so that they may be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So Jesus here is kind of speaking against an individual choosing a public spot for their personal prayers in order to show off to others how righteous they are. So prayers made in that way will do nothing to cultivate an inner faithfulness and will receive no reward from God. Continuing with verses 7 and 8, when you are praying, do not heap up empty phrases like the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. So here we have words against a sort of long-windedness in prayer. Some pastors could probably stand to listen to that.
We have a comment. I think a certain football coach could use a reread of verses 5 and 6.
I was thinking the same thing, but I don't know you people, so I wasn't gonna go anywhere like that yet. But yes, I do think we have some examples from the news recently of things, people who are maybe not paying attention to verses 5 and 6.
Right.
So 7 and 8, speaking against long-windedness in prayer that thinks God will be more likely to answer our prayers if we make them longer and more eloquent. So when we do that, we're forgetting that we're praying to a God who is already intimately aware of our needs and desires. So 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 taken together give us the idea that the proper kind of personal prayer is one that is both secret and simple. So simple and secret prayers are the kind of prayers that will cultivate an inner disposition of faithful obedience, which in turn then always leads to outer compassionate action within the world. So at this point, let me change my slide. At this point, we've reached the prayer itself, which takes up verses 9 through 13. So Jesus gives this as an example of the kind of simple secret prayer that will cultivate righteousness. So in this context, I think each line of the Lord's Prayer can be seen as instructive for both faithfulness in the sense of inner disposition, relationship with God, as well as outer action in the world. So we're going to just kind of take that verse by verse. So verse 9, Jesus says, "Pray then in this way, our Father in heaven, may your name be revered as holy." Of course, we know this more familiarly as, hallowed be your name. So the beginning of the prayer establishes intimate relationship with God using the familial term Father, acknowledging such a relationship with God, that God is our Father, reminds us of this idea of inner faithfulness or inner devotion to God that we are to have, and that should characterize our relationship with God. But this verse also says that the name of God should be hallowed, or in this case, may your name be revered as holy. So if God's name is to be made holy by those who pray this prayer, we will see as we go through the rest of the prayer that an inner disposition of faith should be combined with outer actions of righteousness. That's one interpretation of those words, is that is how God's name is made holy in the world, by living out our faithfulness, not just within ourselves, but on the outside, in our interactions with others. So verse 10 then says, "May your kingdom come, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So here we have this inner faithfulness and outward action connection that I've been talking about made even more explicit. And we pray that God's will would be done on earth as in heaven. So we're asking for a more intimate connection between heaven and earth, so that if we have things that we believe are true within ourselves because of our faith, because of our relationship with God, we're asking that those would be made manifest in the world around us. Verse 11 says, "Give us today our daily bread." So here we see that praying to God is not only about inner spirituality, but has relevance for very practical matters of daily life, our lives and those of our neighbors. I think we often think about this verse as us praying just for our own daily bread, like my own personal daily bread, or the daily bread maybe of my immediate family members. But I think if you've been cultivating the kind of righteousness that Jesus is calling his followers to in the Gospel of Matthew, then we won't be able to help but see the word our includes not just myself and my own family, but my neighbors, both near and far as well. So this petition, if we pray it over and over again, cultivates in us a concern for those who do not have the nourishment that they need for their daily life and labors.
I tried to make that point last week. I don't know if it was convincing or not, but I appreciate you doubling down on it this week.
Okay, good. Yeah, hopefully I'm not going to be too repetitive of what has
No,
already been said.
not at all.
So I think this verse 11 forces us to see that if God's will was done on earth, as we just asked for in the previous verse, then all would have what they need for each day. So God generously supplies enough for all. We see that elsewhere in the Gospels, but it's up to us to take the outer action needed to ensure that it is shared fairly with everyone. Verse 12 is, "And forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors." Different ways that can be translated, of course, but that's the direction that the NRSV has gone in. So once again, we have the connection between the inner faithfulness and the outer action made very explicit. So we begin by asking God to forgive us our debts, or, different versions of the Lord's Prayer, our trespasses, our sins, our debts, different options there. But at any rate, we're asking God to forgive us, right? So when we do that, we're seeking to repair the relationship that we have with God from whatever ways it's been damaged by our failure to cultivate a righteous obedience. But then immediately we're turned outward again. So we can't stay just focused on our own sins, our own debts, and asking God to forgive us for them, because the prayer forces us to recognize the uncomfortable truth that forgiving others is a prerequisite for receiving forgiveness ourselves. And if you think I'm overstating the case, look down at verses 14 and 15, where it says, "For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses." If that is uncomfortable, I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do to take the discomfort away. That's what it says. So praying this prayer has an impact on how we live our lives in the world, as we seek to bring our outer relationships with other people in line with our inner relationship with God. Verse 13 is, "And do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one." So again, it might seem at first that this petition is, fairly personal to me, like I'm asking God to help me overcome my personal trials and temptations. But we know that our temptations often involve other people, and we know that our trials are not just for us alone. Even here, there's an intimate relationship between what we experience in the world, how we behave towards others, and our relationship with God. So the connection between the first petition, where we're asking God's name to be made holy in the world, the connection between that and the rest of the prayer is, I think, nicely summed up by a quote that I used in my article that I want to read. And this is by a scholar named Douglas Hare, who writes, "God's name is hallowed as we witness to his nature by caring for the poor, forgiving those who have trespassed against us, and resisting temptation." So as readers, we're called on to pray in this way. Jesus says, right, pray in this way, so that we can learn how to be disciples. And as we pray, we grow both in faith and obedience, in inward disposition and in outward action. So this is what I've called, I think I failed to mention this at the start, this is the section of the article that I call praying to learn. So we're using this prayer in order to learn to be disciples. So before I go into the Luke part, we can pause for some conversation. These are very general questions, so feel free to go in another direction in the discussion if you want to. But the questions I have here are, in what ways does the context of the Sermon on the Mount influence your understanding of the Lord's Prayer? And how might this particular interpretation of the prayer speak to you personally, to your church community, or to the world we live in today? So were there aspects of my presentation that you feel really resonate or are a needed message for us today, for our world today? Let me just stop the share while we're having that conversation.
Well, I'll just say that I don't think I've ever really paid attention to where this shows up in Matthew. I mean, like, that whole passage is so very familiar about, don't pray, the image of praying in a closet, and the fasting, always that we read, I don't know if it's the Matthew passage or somewhere else, on Ash Wednesday, I always think it's so weird that we read on Ash Wednesday when we're sticking something on our forehead that they're going to go walk out and proclaim to everyone our piety, right? That we read this thing about don't practice your piety. But anyways, I just am sort of marveling at the fact that I've never really stopped to think, why is this prayer in the middle of a Sermon on the Mount? Like, what was Matthew doing? Like, stringing all these teachings together, and that the teachings on prayer and this model prayer would be in the middle of it. I'm sitting with that for a little while, both my own ignorance and just what does it actually mean.
For me, it was so stunning that sort of threefold, like, beware of practicing your righteousness, and then it talks about alms, prayer, and fasting, and the Lord's Prayer comes in that second section. And to me, it sort of diminishes the just because it's nestled in the midst of this bigger context. whereas the Lord's Prayer has always stood out so profoundly, I guess, because we place so much emphasis on it in worship. But it really is just like, bullet point 2 in this explanation of what it looks like to practice your righteousness in the world. So sort of fascinating for me to think about.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate, Jen, you're just driving home the connection between inner and outer. And I mean, everything you said connected inner and outer, and faith and behavior are bonded together, and it's part of a learning thing, part of learning to be a disciple and having inner faith connected with outer righteousness. I have a quick question. So what does UE on the end of NRSV mean?
Updated edition.
Updated
Yeah,
edition.
sorry, I didn't say that right. I didn't explain myself when I commented on that. Yeah, so thanks for asking.
All right, yeah, now I'm curious about getting a copy of that.
Yeah, it just came out. I think the print copies are not even out yet, if I'm not mistaken. The digital copies started to be released at the very end of last year, I think. But when you go on Amazon to order a print Bible, it still says, I don't know, like August something is the ship date.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Yeah, I noticed, as the Bible Gateway, it started bumping you right over. There's no longer an NRSV on Bible Gateway. It's NRSV.
Right.
So,
right, which annoys me sometimes because I want to compare the two.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, can you guys give us both? Because that's the whole reason I've used Bible Gateways, to look at you next to each other.
Right.
So I was wondering, I find it interesting that Jesus uses the do this in private, go in the closet by yourself, but then continues on using plural pronoun, plural personal throughout the prayer. It's go pray by yourself, but you're still praying for us, and it's still we, give us this day. And I was trying to decide if I found if I was feeling like there was some inconsistency there, but I don't think so. The more I think about it, it's just, but I do find that interesting that it's okay, go by yourself. But even though you're by yourself, it's not all about you.
Yeah, that is interesting. I didn't talk about the pronouns in my article, but that would be an interesting additional avenue to, explore and think about. I definitely agree.
Well, and of course, I don't have it in front of me, but like at the beginning, it's a warning about practicing your righteousness in front of others, and what your reasons for doing it are. It's not a prohibition against it,
right?
So it's being thoughtful about it. I've also been thinking too about context of, so when we do take it out of the literary context and we put it into the context of worship, where we put it in worship also says something. I don't know if Ginter Park people even notice or remember, we used to say the Lord's Prayer as part of the opening prayer. We had it was at the end of the invocation. And somewhere along the line, I moved it and I moved it to be part of the prayers of the people, or the pastoral prayer, as the way we closed that out as the sort of joint petition kind of thing. And then of course, a lot of times in when you have communion, a lot of traditions, you pray the Lord's Prayer in the middle of that whole thing, as a preparatory of getting ready for communion. So I think that's just sort of interesting that it can be used in these different ways, and it does something different, I think, depending upon how and where you're using it in worship.
That's a great point. I love that.
Yeah, I remember one time, a long time ago, I was doing a sermon about, I don't even remember what the specific text was, but it was in this neighborhood. But at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, after the Beatitudes, Jesus says, "Let your light so shine before others that they see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." And then it's like, the next chapter is like, but don't do good stuff in front of other people. So I think, the only sense I can make of it is that in order to be seen by them part is really important, right? So in 6:1, don't practice your righteousness in front of other people in order to be seen by them. So he's really calling out that intention. What is your intention in practicing your righteousness? Is it to serve the world or to live out your faith in God, or is it so that people can see you do it?
Yeah, this
Yeah.
passage specifically is always my warning to myself. If I'm, those of us who pray, as ministers in front of a church are always, praying, hopefully on behalf of the congregation, but not preaching in our prayer. And how often do we find ourselves like, I didn't say what I wanted in my sermon, so I'm going to stick into prayer. Like, no, stop that. It's not the point. So,
Right. Yeah.
Well, and a popular feature of the ancient world was, wealthy people would do good works for the good of the community, like, pave a road or build a temple or such and such, and then their name would be
by
put
the
up.
ancient world, you mean yesterday?
Well, I mean, some things haven't changed so much. I'm thinking of this. Jen, you I'm sure know more about it than I do, but like Erastus was a city treasurer in Corinth, mentioned in one of Paul's letters, maybe Corinthians, but they found like a paver in Corinth with this person's name on it because he apparently paved the road or the square or something. And those things were for the good of the community, but also built your honor and so forth. And so I think Jesus is resisting that trend too of doing good things. He's arguing for outer works that reflect your inner righteousness for the good of others. So welcome, Braxton Kemp. Oh, and Eric says donor bricks at any church or school or and so forth.
Yeah, I'm thinking of every like pew with a plaque on it saying given in, by such and such. Every bronze cross and communion set that has the in memory of or in honor of. Given to the glory of God and.
Right. Yeah. Definitely good things to think about and not easy to navigate because it's not so easy always to do things differently, right? We live in systems that can be hard to shift and change. But the Sermon on the Mount definitely challenges us to try to live counterculturally. So I think based on the time, it probably would be prudent for me to continue my presentation with Luke.
Take us to Luke. Yes, this is great so far.
My screen again. All right. So as I said, the first part of the presentation was called Praying to Learn because we were praying the Lord's Prayer in order to learn to be disciples of Jesus. Flipping it around here in Luke and calling this section Learning to Pray. So Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer does not come in the context of a sermon about righteousness, but rather it comes in response to Jesus' disciples asking him to teach them how to pray. A little more straightforward, maybe. So that's what comes before the prayer, is that Jesus' disciples ask him to teach them to pray. And then right after the Lord's Prayer is a parable about the need to pray with persistence. So the immediate literary context, both before and after, suggests that the Lord's Prayer in Luke is part of Jesus' teaching about prayer itself and how to pray. So while in Matthew, the focus was on simple secret prayer as a means to cultivate righteousness in the life of a disciple, in Luke, the focus is on the act of prayer itself and how one goes about doing it. In other words, learning to pray. So I'm going to go ahead and get the context for us up here on the screen again. It's important to note that what sets the stage for the teaching of the Lord's Prayer in Luke is that Jesus was himself praying at the start of chapter 11. So I've got a little context from the end of chapter 10 up there. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes, but right now we're starting at 11:1. We see that Jesus himself was praying in a certain place. And after he had finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray as John taught his disciples." So they see him praying and they want to learn how to do this as well. Now, Jesus has already been depicted as being in prayer prior to this point in the story in the Gospel of Luke. We've also been told that it was his habit to withdraw and pray regularly. So to Luke, and this is again, emphasized in Luke even more so than in the other Gospels, that Jesus had this type of prayer life. So to Luke, prayer is an essential part of the faithful life because it connects us to God. So why is Jesus going off to pray all the time? It's because he's nurturing his connection to God, right? So that prayer as a source of connection is really what Luke is focusing on. And Jesus focuses on nurturing that connection, both for his own sake and to set an example for his disciples. So the fact that Luke views prayer as a way to connect with God can be seen even more clearly when we expand our view of the literary context of the Lord's Prayer up into the last part of chapter 10, where we have the story of Mary and Martha. And I'm just going to read that to refresh our memories. Now, as they went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him. She had a sister named Mary who sat at Jesus' feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things, but few things are needed. Indeed, only one. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." Now, this story is open to many different interpretations, and we could easily spend the rest of the night just talking about Mary and Martha. However, we're not going to do that. So despite many different interpretations that have been given to this story, one thing that is clear is that Mary's action of sitting at Jesus' feet and listening to his word is held up by Luke as a model of discipleship. So disciples are those who nurture their connection to God by sitting at the feet of Jesus. So in the story, if we take it as a literal story, of course, Mary is literally sitting at Jesus' feet, listening to him. She's not praying, right? This is not a moment where she's praying. But nevertheless, her story has often been read by interpreters as a model for Christian prayer and contemplation. So if we follow her example, then we will be praying to nurture our connection with Jesus and with God. So the story is often read to teach us the importance of finding quiet spaces in the midst of a busy life to pray to God and to try to listen for God's voice. So I would say that those who follow Mary's example take time to nurture their connection to God, no matter how many daily tasks there are to be done. So this story is often, or I shouldn't say often, sometimes interpreted as a critique of Martha's busyness. All right, so being quiet and contemplative is better than being busy. But when we read it carefully, it's actually not Martha's activity that is ever critiqued or criticized, but only her worry and distraction. That's all. That's the only thing that Jesus calls out about what she's doing. So I would say that Mary's mindfulness in this moment helps us see that we can be present to what's happening right in front of us in such a way that we can nurture a connection to God, even while performing those many daily necessary tasks that we have to do each day. So one doesn't need to go up a mountain or on a retreat to nurture connection with the divine. I would also argue, considering the context here of the Lord's Prayer, that it may not only be Jesus' own example in chapter 11, verse 1, that inspires the disciples to ask him to teach them to pray, but also Mary's example that they have just observed in the previous moment, Mary's devotion of sitting at Jesus' feet that they have just watched. And now they come to Jesus and say, "Teach us to pray." So I'm not going to go through the Lord's Prayer verse by verse like I did with Matthew. As I said before, the content is mostly the same, but we're just focusing on the content and the different idea that the content gives us. So that's what comes before it. Now, what comes after it? We see that while encouraging readers to nurture a connection to God through prayer is clearly important to Luke, based on everything I've just said, Luke also acknowledges through this literary context that this is not always easy. When Jesus expands his teaching on prayer after he gives the Lord's Prayer itself, he begins with a parable about a man seeking bread from his neighbor at midnight so that he can show hospitality to a traveler. So I'm going to read that starting at verse 5. And he said to them, "Suppose one of you has a friend, and you go to him at midnight and say to him, 'Friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread, for a friend of mine has arrived, and I have nothing to set before him.' And he answers from within, 'Do not bother me. The door has already been locked, and my children are with me in bed. I cannot get up and give you anything.' I tell you, even though he will not get up and give him anything out of friendship, at least because of his persistence, he will get up and give him whatever he needs. So we see in the parable that the neighbor is at first unwilling to respond, citing the inconvenience of getting out of bed at midnight and disturbing his sleeping children. I can relate to that. Through this parable, Jesus allows his listeners to wrestle honestly with how prayer can sometimes feel, like a one-sided conversation lacking a response from the one we are petitioning. After all, when we're honest, we know that despite all our prayers, we continue to have personal and communal and global problems galore. So what's the solution for those who feel this kind of discouragement? According to Jesus here, it is persistence. Jesus ends the parable by saying that the neighbor will give in if the man keeps asking him over and over. And then he goes on to instruct his hearers beyond what's on the screen here. He goes on to instruct his hearers to continue to ask things of God, to seek God, and to knock on God's door. So they should do this, he says, knowing that God is the one who gives good gifts to us. So it is a teaching that doesn't deny the suffering of the world and the injustice that we see in the world. And yet it exhibits faith in God's goodness and a hope for the future, nurtured by a stubborn persistence in prayer. So sandwiched between the example of Mary's devotion and the parable of perseverance in prayer, the Lord's Prayer in Luke stresses the importance of connection to God and helps us form a regular habit of prayer that persists. So when the disciples ask Jesus to teach them to pray, he doesn't tell them when to do it or with whom or how to position their bodies. These are all issues that are relevant to prayer in many religions throughout the world and even in Christianity as well. But this is not the answer that Jesus gives. He gives them the actual content of what they should be praying for, the very words to use to do it. So this is, I think, maybe can be experienced as a gift for those who feel overwhelmed by cares, like Martha did in the previous story, or those who are doubting that God is actually present and responsive, as we see illustrated by the parable that follows. Jesus says, pray for God's kingdom to come, pray for your own daily needs and those of others, pray for forgiveness, and pray to be kept from trials and temptations. Even if you have a lot to do that day, even if you aren't sure that God is going to respond, you keep praying for those same things over and over again. And this is how you nurture a connection to God that will sustain you through your overwhelming tasks, through doubts, and even through trials and temptations. So this is what it means in Luke to learn to pray. That prayer connects us with God. So I have here basically the same discussion questions as before. I've just substituted the context in Luke rather than the context of the Sermon on the Mount. What difference does that make to you after you've heard this second part of our conversation, and how might that particular interpretation of the prayer speak to you personally, your church community, or the world we live in today? So any responses to that?
I think for me, what's so interesting about Luke is the constant reminder of like Luke immediately follows it with like the parable of like the loaves, and we're reminded yet again about bread. We're reminded about like manna, if you will. And I just think it's really interesting how Luke kind of ties it together with give us this day our daily bread. And then right next, the very next thing is this parable here, where bread comes up again as a topic of conversation.
Yeah, so it's an important symbolism within the gospel, this idea of bread that we have in the Lord's Prayer and then elsewhere. Yeah, that's definitely true.
I was reading this passage earlier because it's the lectionary for this week, and I find it funny as we're talking about bread and food now. Is the next thing Jesus doubles down on the food reference with, if you're, who among you who are evil, as he describes them, he says, even those of you who are evil, if a child asks you for a child asks you for fish, are you going to give the child a scorpion? Or if the child asks for an egg, are you going to give them a snake? I might have reversed that. but God's going to give you not a scorpion if you've asked for it, which just seemed like a interesting continuing of that metaphor, but it also puts kind of concretely the give us this day our daily bread, and so doubles down on that, yes, okay, give us this day our daily fish and not scorpions. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I noticed verse 9 and 13 do seem to be relevant to in the context where it's ask and it will be given to you, search and you shall find, and knock and the door will be open to you. So sort of continues to continue that theme of like persistence in prayer and trust and maybe assurance that, God is listening and God will respond.
Yeah. Yeah. I probably should have put that on the screen too. I didn't want to make the words even smaller.
It's fair enough.
But yeah, you're right. The context that I'm talking about does continue into that section.
Mm.
I find myself laughing at the image of God as a parent of kids who won't go to sleep. As one whose child does not like to go to sleep at night.
Well, and it's funny too, thinking of context, like this context of the disciples asking Jesus to teach them to pray, like that is the context I think of when I think of where does the Lord's Prayer, like what's going on? It's Jesus' response to a request. And yet it's the Virgin of Matthew that
right.
so that doesn't really matter because it's but yeah, so that was kind of like, oh yeah, this is the context. If you ask me what was happening, it's and I didn't think that isn't how it happened in Matthew.
Yeah, I'm not going to be thinking of the Lord's Prayer as an example of the Beatitudes, necessarily. The Lord's Prayer that we speak, that we say on a regular basis. So.
Again, it's the model prayer, right? So that's it's not yeah.
And that I appreciated this, Jen, that the disciples were possibly springing off of Mary's example, that not just Jesus's, but that she had been commended and even though she wasn't praying, she was in that attitude of listening. And I like that bookend between her as that example and then this just persistence. And so that story at the end is persisting in prayer to God. That's the point of that, correct? Is that right?
Well, it's a parable, so it has to be open to multiple interpretations.
Right,
the question
right.
is, what do you think that parable is about?
Yeah, I was glad to be reminded that came right after that in Luke. Yeah.
What you said, I think, is a comfort to me about Mary and Martha, Jen. With two young kids, like days are full, and like I can't sit at Jesus's feet because I'm gonna have a kid in my lap and another kid begging for a snack and another kid, I don't know, fill in the blank. It's parenting is a full-time job on top of a full-time job, so
or you can always give them a snake. So.
Scorpion.
Well, and you can remember also that Jesus said to let the little children come to him. So you can still be sitting at Jesus' feet when you have a kid on your lap.
Yes, right. No, and that's what I'm saying is like the worry and distraction are sort of, criticism seems a little bit too admonished. That's sort of how Jesus admonishes Martha, not so much her attention to the tasks, which are necessary, I think, in the context of hospitality in the first century, but so someone who struggles to make time for prayer, of the sort where I go into the closet and quiet my spirit, I really appreciate that word of encouragement.
Art, in the language of parenting, I see what Jesus does here, not even as an admonishment, but it's a redirection.
Yeah.
Redirection. Yeah, good. I do have a conclusion, so I'm gonna share my screen again. right. So just to sum up, the whole presentation, we've seen that the different contexts in which Lord's Prayer is found in Matthew and Luke lead to different emphases in its interpretation. So the Lord's Prayer in Matthew, which I've called praying to learn, we see that the prayer is an avenue for readers to grow in faith and obedience, connecting inner disposition to outer action. While in Luke, learning to pray, the prayer is an avenue for connection to God and perseverance in our faith life. So these two emphases are different, and it's helpful, I think, to observe that difference. If I didn't think so, I wouldn't have done the whole presentation for the last hour. However, that said, it doesn't mean that they're sort of contradictory or so different that, we can't combine them together into sort of a coherent understanding of how this prayer can be meaningful. It would be a mistake, for example, to think that the Lord's Prayer in Matthew connects spirituality to action, while Luke's version is only about a spiritual connection to God and has nothing to do with how we live in the world. This would be a very grave misunderstanding of the Lucan idea of discipleship. So to see that prayer and action are also combined in Luke is something that we can see more clearly when we expand the Lord's Prayer, the context of the Lord's Prayer, even further than we already have. So we looked at the Lord's Prayer in the context of the story of Mary and Martha. But what comes right before that is the parable of the Good Samaritan. So some people have interpreted the Mary and Martha story as saying that passivity is being praised because Martha, who's active and does stuff, is corrected, while Mary, who does nothing but sit silently, is praised. But to conclude from that discipleship is a passive endeavor is not a good reading of the story in context. So again, the story that comes right before Mary and Martha is the Good Samaritan parable. And in that parable, of course, the one who takes action is praised, not the ones who do nothing but pass by, like the more passive ones that who just pass by. So the Good Samaritan takes action. Mary engages in what we might call contemplative devotion. And both of them are models of Lucan discipleship, illustrating the truth that was revealed in Luke chapter 8, verse 21, where we learn that Jesus' family are those who hear the word of God and do it. So both hearing and doing are necessary for the faithful life. So we have an example of doing in the Good Samaritan, an example of hearing in Mary. And we need both of them to get a full picture of what discipleship is meant to look like in the Gospel of Luke. So I think we can safely assume that the Lord's Prayer in this larger context is not only about inner connection to God, but also about cultivating a discipleship that combines action and devotion. But even though I'm making this concluding argument that these two different settings of the Lord's Prayer are compatible with each other, that doesn't mean that we should flatten them into meaning exactly the same thing. The two different contexts for the Lord's Prayer in our canon give us two different messages that might be relevant at different times and to different communities at different times. So good biblical interpretation considers the context. The job of the reader then is not to only read the text itself, and it's not even to only read the literary context around the text itself, but it's also to read your own context and to discern the message that you and your communities need to hear most right now, which maybe sometimes will be more the Matthew version and maybe sometimes will be more the Luke version, depending on what is happening in your life or in your community or in the world at that particular time. So that's it for my presentation. Are there any other further reflections or comments?
So I was curious if anyone, Jennifer, Art, or anyone of you had a thought on the other context, the historical context of both, and the different context of Luke and Matthew, and if those may play a part into how they're placed and what the points be, is there a relation between the point you've made and maybe what the historical context of those two gospels are?
So that's not something that I thought about a lot before, so I'll be thinking on my feet here.
Sure.
The first thing that came to my mind when you said that was the idea that people often call Matthew the most Jewish of the Gospels. So Matthew has a more Jewish audience
Sure.
for what he's doing. And so the Lord's Prayer then comes in the context of his explanation of the law, right? So, and saying that the law is not being thrown out, right? The law is still relevant, but here's how you should interpret it. I don't know what that means really for the Lord's Prayer, but it's just the first place my mind went when you said
I've been wondering, it's kind of similarly, the over stereotyped version of Matthew as the Jewish and Luke as the Gentile. It's not that easy, but sometimes it's easy to delineate it that way. I was wondering, are we looking at the more kind of wrote, here's how to do, here's the question of how do we do, and here's the answer of how we do, showing up in the Gentile gospel. And does that make one more useful for preaching in one context and the other more useful for preaching in another context? I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud the way, because I don't have an answer. I was just curious if anybody had any thoughts.
You have any thoughts, Art, on historical context for the two gospels?
No, not off the top of my head. I was taken, you said which one is speaking to you more today. My article was on the Roman imperial context, and so politically oriented reading. And so mine was almost exclusively oriented towards outer action. I've dwelled very little on like inner disposition or connection to God and stuff. I'm really appreciating how this is sort of like balancing out the perspective that I tried to bring last week. So I'm really grateful for that.
And I think Meg's going to give us the other direction and take us inward next week. So
yeah, Meg Lacey Vega's printing next week. She's a yoga instructor and sort of talking about the ways in which the Lord's Prayer sort of settles into our bodies, and it's very embodied perspective. So, but Jen, I loved your article. I thought it was fantastic, and just, had never really given a thought to it, the way in which both are located uniquely in their larger gospel context. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you. I thought this was great. I got a lot of insights from this. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
When you talk about Luke, I think about Luke and the concern for the poor, and like, to me, that's a very much action oriented stuff and things that you do, and it's overwhelming. And then to sort of see the Lord's Prayer coming as something encouraging and perseverance, again, to break down the systems of empire, is interesting to me.
Good stuff. Well, Jen, thank you so much. Thanks, Ginter Park folks, for joining us. Jen, best of wishes to you as you hope you feel better soon. I'll be eager to hear, but certainly looking forward to being in touch, and maybe run into you at SBL in November if you're going. So,
Great.
yeah.
Sounds great. Have a good night,
Awesome.
everyone.
Thank you.
See y'all.
Bye, y'all. This was good.
Yeah, see you next week. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.